My daughter's fiancé asked about the orchard's property lines 4 times before I started counting. The 5th time, I put down my mug and looked at him the way I used to look at witnesses who weren't quite answering the question. 31 years on the bench teaches you to notice when someone is circling something. On the morning of Sophie's wedding, while I was pinning her veil in the upstairs bedroom of the house her father built, she pressed a folded piece of paper into my palm. 4 words in her handwriting: Mum, stop the wedding. 200 guests were already seated in the orchard below. The September sun was warm on the Okanagan Valley. Evan was standing at the end of the aisle in a suit that had cost more than our first car. I had a choice to make. I walked down that aisle and I made it. Evan Marsh came into our lives the way certain men do, precisely, like he'd rehearsed the entrance. Sophie called me on a Sunday in March, breathless in that way she gets when she's happy and also slightly terrified of her own happiness. His name is Evan. He's thoughtful and funny, and I think you're going to like him, Mum. She'd said something similar about the man before him, the one who'd borrowed $4,000 and moved to Toronto. But I kept that thought to myself. He drove up from Vancouver in April for Easter. I'd spent 2 days making the kind of meal Edmund used to make. Roast lamb, the pickled beets Sophie grew up complaining about and now requests every visit, a lemon tart I've been making since before she was born. Evan walked through the door holding a bottle of Okanagan Red and complimented the house in the specific way of someone who has already looked it up online. "This place is stunning," he said, and his eyes moved across the beams. Edmund had milled himself, the windows overlooking the rows of apple trees, the valley dropping away toward the lake. "I didn't realize you were so close to Kelowna." He was 36, dark-haired, the kind of handsome that comes partly from grooming and partly from knowing it. He worked in wealth management, he said, for a firm in downtown Vancouver. He'd grown up in Calgary. He had a way of listening when you talked that made you feel like you were the most interesting person in the room, and I recognized that from the bench. It's a skill. It can be genuine. It can also be practiced. The Easter weekend was pleasant. He helped clear the table, asked Sophie's old friends the right questions, charmed my neighbor when she stopped by with rhubarb from her garden. I told myself I was being cautious in the way mothers of adult children sometimes are. But on the Sunday morning, when I came downstairs early to start coffee, I found Evan on the back porch. He didn't hear me open the door. He was standing at the railing, looking out over the orchard. 180 acres of it, Edmund's life's work, with an expression I couldn't quite name. Not wonder, something more deliberate. "Beautiful morning," I said, and he turned, and the smile was back immediately. "How much of the land is yours?" he asked. "All the way to those trees." I told him. The orchard ended at the ridgeline to the east and the creek bed to the south. He nodded like he was filing it away. I went inside and started the coffee and told myself it was curiosity. He was a city person. City people ask about land. He was back in May and again in June. Each visit, the questions about the property surfaced in a different form. What was the assessed value for property tax? Did I hold the mineral rights? What was the status of the road easement along the south fence? He framed them as casual conversation, the way you might ask about a neighbor's renovation, but 31 years of listening to testimony leaves you sensitive to the difference between curiosity and research. Sophie had set a date by then. October 18th. Right here at the orchard, in the rows between the honeycrisp trees, the way she'd always talked about when she was small. The wedding planning gave Evan reasons to be at the property often, and each visit, the questions came. How was the estate structured? Did I have a will? Had I thought about what would happen to the orchard if my health changed? "He's just interested," Sophie said when I mentioned it carefully. "He works in finance, Mum. It's how his brain works." Maybe. Edmund had been an engineer. His brain had worked in load tolerances and drainage calculations. He hadn't asked my mother about her balance sheet. I sat in Edmund's study the night after the 5th visit, and I pulled out the file folder where I kept the property documents. Edmund had bought this land in 1989 for $240,000. Last year, a realtor who was courting my business sent an unsolicited appraisal. $4.8 million based on current Okanagan benchmarks and the water license alone. Edmund hadn't liked talking about it. We're not rich, he used to say. We're land rich, which is different. What we had was tied up in trees and soil, and 40 years of knowing exactly what to do with both. I picked up the phone and called Kathleen. Kathleen had handled Edmund's estate after he passed. She was meticulous, unsentimental in exactly the way you want your estate solicitor to be, and she had known Edmund since before Sophie was born. If anyone could tell me I was being a paranoid retired judge who'd spent too long looking for dishonesty, it was her. She didn't tell me that. "How long have they been together?" she asked when I'd finished explaining. 7 months, engaged since June. A pause that said something. That's fast. I know. "Dorothy," she said, "I've been doing estate law for 22 years. The people who ask the most specific questions about a client's property arrangements are rarely the ones with the purest motives." She paused. "I'm not saying that's what this is, but let me look." She called me back 4 days later and asked me to come to her office. The folder she slid across her desk was not thick, but it was dense. His name had come up in a complaint file shared informally between estate practitioners in BC and Alberta. Not a conviction. Nothing had ever gone to charges, but a pattern. 2 prior engagements to women from families with significant assets. The first was a woman named Alicia, whose father was a retired petroleum engineer in Calgary. The engagement ended 2 weeks after Evan attended a family meeting about transferring assets into a family trust. Her family paid him $150,000 to break the engagement and sign a release, quietly, the way you do when you can't prove intent but can't afford the alternative. The second was a woman named Denise, whose mother owned lakefront property in the eastern townships of Quebec. Same pattern, same exit. Her family had paid $200,000 to make it go away. "He's never touched money directly," Kathleen said. "He asks questions, attends meetings, gathers information, then exits when whatever leverage he was building doesn't materialize fast enough or moves to the next opportunity." I thought of Sophie, of the way she looked at him, of the way he looked at the orchard. What do? We find out who he actually is. Kathleen recommended a man named Bruce. He'd been with the RCMP for 16 years before opening his own investigative practice in Kelowna. He was the kind of person who seemed to occupy a room without filling it. Quiet in a way that was deliberate, not shy. He installed 3 cameras in my house the morning after we met. 1 in the kitchen behind a line of mason jars, 1 in the living room tucked inside the clock. Edmund had built in his woodshop, 1 by the front entry inside what looked like an ordinary smoke detector. "They're motion activated," he said, "encrypted, legal under BC's Privacy Act." Kathleen's already confirmed that with a judge. He called me 4 days later and asked to come back. Evan Marsh was a name he'd been using since 2018. His legal name change had been filed in Alberta. His birth name was Tyler Ryan Rourke, and there was an outstanding arrest warrant for him in Ontario. Fraud and breach of trust, charges stemming from a forged document in an estate matter in Hamilton. He'd been charged for his scheduled court date in the spring of 2019, see spring of 2000 in. He'd been careful since then, nothing in his own name. A driver's license that, on close inspection, had been issued from an address that didn't exist. I set my mug down on the table very carefully. Who is he really? Bruce opened the second folder. Gary Rourke had run a mid-size land development company out of Kamloops. In 2006, Rourke Land Holdings had submitted a bid for a major mixed-use development on the edge of Kelowna, a project that would have kept the company solvent for a decade. They lost the bid to a consortium Edmund was part of, a group of local landowners and investors who'd pooled resources and submitted a competing proposal. It was a legitimate competition. Edmund's group won on the merits. What followed wasn't unusual in the development business, but it was brutal. Rourke Land Holdings had taken on significant debt in anticipation of winning that contract. When they didn't, the debt didn't go away. The 2008 financial crisis made it worse. By 2009, the company was in receivership. Gary Rourke died in March of 2011. He was 54 years old. Tyler was 19. Bruce showed me a high school yearbook image from 2009, 2 years before his father died. The face was unmistakably the same face that had stood in my kitchen asking about easements and mineral rights. He hadn't come here for the orchard. He'd come here for Edmund's orchard. He'd come here because Edmund was gone, and he couldn't make Edmund pay, so he'd found the next best target. He was going to tear her apart, everything Edmund had built, through Sophie, through me, through a marriage that had never been about love. Sophie had no idea she was being used as a vehicle for a grief that had curdled into something calculated and cold over 15 years. 3 weeks after Bruce installed the cameras, my family doctor called. Meredith had been my physician for over a decade. She was careful, professional, not given to alarming her patients without cause. The fact that she called at 7 in the evening told me everything. "I need to tell you something," she said, "as your physician, and as someone who has known you for a long time." Evan had come to her clinic 2 weeks earlier. He'd introduced himself as my future son-in-law and said he was worried about me. He'd described episodes of confusion, of repeating myself, of getting disoriented in familiar places. "None of that is true," she said, and then, before I could speak, "I know, that's why I'm calling." He'd asked her very specific questions. What were the clinical criteria for a finding of mental incapacity in British Columbia? What documentation would a physician need to provide if a family member sought to invoke a power of attorney for property? What medications could cause cognitive symptoms in a woman my age? He'd specifically asked about lorazepam, dosing onset, duration of effect. My hand was steady on the phone. 31 years on the bench. You learn to stay steady. "Meredith," I said, "what would happen if someone were found, on multiple documented occasions, to be confused and unable to manage her own affairs?" Under the Patient's Property Act, a court could appoint a committee to manage her finances and property, she said. Someone else would be making decisions. She let that sit. Dorothy, he wasn't asking as a worried future son-in-law. He was asking as someone researching a legal process. I thought about every time Evan had offered to pour my tea, every time he'd insisted on making coffee, every time he'd been in the kitchen alone while I was in another room. "Don't eat or drink anything he prepares," Meredith said. "And don't be alone with him if you can help it." "Thank you," I said, "for calling." "You spent 31 years protecting people who couldn't protect themselves," she said. "Someone ought to return the favor." We met in Kathleen's boardroom on the 15th of September. Kathleen, Bruce, Meredith, and Corporal Ron Baxter from the Kelowna RCMP detachment, who came in civilian clothes and sat with his hands folded on the table the way people do when they've heard worse and survived it. The plan was simple. I would invite Evan to dinner alone, create an opportunity, leave a glass of water unattended, let the cameras do their work. "If he does nothing, we try again," Bruce said. "But based on what he asked your doctor, he's ready to move. The wedding is in 3 weeks. He's running out of time." Kathleen had signed statements from Alicia's family in Calgary and from Denise's family in Quebec, Both had agreed to come forward now that there was something more substantive than a broken engagement. Corporal Baxter had been in contact with Hamilton about the outstanding warrant. I called Evan on a Tuesday evening and kept my voice easy. "Sophie mentioned you're in Kelowna tomorrow. I thought it might be nice to have dinner, just the two of us. I feel like we haven't had much chance to talk properly with all the wedding chaos." He agreed immediately, a beat too quickly. He arrived Wednesday at 6:30 with a bouquet of flowers and the specific kind of warmth that is entirely performative. We ate on the porch, the orchard going gold in the September light. He was charming. He asked about Edmund's early years building the cider business. He said all the right things about Sophie. Then, right on schedule, he steered the conversation toward the future. "Have you given much thought to your estate arrangements?" he asked, cutting neatly through his food. "My clients who wait until something happens. It can get complicated quickly. I work with an excellent notary here in Kelowna. I could arrange an introduction." "Kathleen handles everything," I said. "She always has." Something shifted behind his eyes. It was gone in less than a second. At 7:15, I pressed 2 fingers to my temple and excused myself, went to the kitchen, filled a glass of water from the tap, left it on the counter, walked toward the stairs, said I needed to lie down for a few minutes, and left him alone. I went upstairs, opened the tablet Bruce had configured, and watched the camera feed. He waited perhaps 30 seconds. Then he stood, walked to the base of the stairs, and listened. Came back to the kitchen, reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, produced a small amber prescription bottle. He worked quickly. He found a spoon in the second drawer, not the one I'd used, a clean one from the back, and crushed the tablet against the counter. Tipped the powder into my glass, stirred it, tapped the spoon against the rim, folded it into a paper towel and set it at the edge of the sink. Put the bottle back in his pocket. Arranged himself at the table before I made my footsteps audible on the stairs. "Feeling any better?" he asked when I appeared. "A little." I moved toward the kitchen. He stood immediately. "Here," he said, and he picked up the glass and brought it to me himself, our fingers touching on the cool surface. "You should stay hydrated." My phone buzzed at that exact moment, set to ring on a timer Bruce had programmed. I turned away, and in the same motion, I wrapped the glass in a dish towel, preserving whatever prints were on it, and poured the water down the drain. When I turned back, the glass sat in the sink, his fingerprints intact on the outside. He left 20 minutes later, said I should rest. Bruce was through my door in under a minute, gloves already on. He collected the glass, the spoon, the paper towel, everything Tyler Rourke had touched. Meredith called the next morning. Lorazepam, 4 milligrams, 4 times a therapeutic dose for someone my age. In that quantity, she said, it could cause severe disorientation, loss of balance, loss of consciousness. If I had been alone when it took effect, if someone had been there to document what it looked like. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The wedding morning was clear and warm. Okanagan Septembers are generous that way. I was in Sophie's old bedroom, doing up the small buttons on the back of her dress, when she went very still. "Mum," her voice was different, not nervous bride different, something underneath it. She turned to face me. Her eyes were full, but not with happiness. "I need to tell you something. I've been trying to for 3 days, and I keep not being able to." She reached into the small inner pocket of her dress. She'd had the seamstress add it. Said she always wanted somewhere to carry a note from her father on her wedding day, and she pressed a folded piece of paper into my hand. I opened it. 4 words, "Mum, stop the wedding." She had gone to surprise Evan at his hotel in Kelowna 2 evenings before the rehearsal. She'd heard voices through the partially open door and stood in the hallway not moving, while he talked to someone she didn't recognize. She heard him say my name. She heard him describe, in a tone she said was businesslike and completely without feeling, exactly how the next several months were supposed to unfold. The documented confusion. The physician contact. The application to the Patients' Property Act Tribunal. The power of attorney that would give him access to the land. The land he called, with a precision that made her sick, the Ridgewood parcel. Edmund had named the orchard Ridgewood, after the ridge to the east, It was on the gate, on the cider bottles, on the deed. He had known exactly what he was coming for since before he walked through our door that Easter with his bottle of Okanagan Red. He hadn't said Edmund's name. He'd called him the contractor, the one whose consortium had taken the Kelowna development bid in 2006. He'd been planning this since he was old enough to plan something. Sophie had sat in her car in the hotel parking lot for 45 minutes afterward. She'd driven halfway home and turned around. She'd spent 2 days not sleeping, telling herself she'd misheard, that there was an explanation, that the man she'd been with for 10 months wasn't this person. She hadn't misheard. "I know," I said quietly. "I know what he is." She stared at me. "How long?" "Long enough. I've been building the case." She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, and I held her until it passed. I told her about Kathleen, and Bruce, and Meredith, and Corporal Baxter. I told her about the camera footage, the lab results, the women in Calgary and Quebec, the warrant in Ontario, the truth about Tyler Rourke and why he had chosen us. She sat on the edge of her bed in her wedding dress for a long time without speaking. "What do we do?" she said at last. "We walk down that aisle," I said, "and we tell 200 people exactly who is standing at the end of it." Her jaw set in the way Edmund's used to when he'd made a decision he wasn't going to be argued out of. She was her father's daughter, and that morning I had never been more grateful for it. The string quartet was playing something I didn't recognize as we reached the garden gate. 200 chairs arranged in the rows between the honeycrisp trees, the mountains beyond the ridge, pale blue in the September light. The apple trees heavy, with fruit not yet ready to pick. Sophie took my arm. She was trembling slightly, but her chin was up. Evan waited at the end of the aisle. His brother stood beside him as best man. Corporal Baxter sat in the 4th row on the left, in civilian clothes, as we had arranged. Meredith was at the front. Kathleen sat near the aisle with a folder across her knees. We walked. The officiant began. I sat in the front row and listened to the language of permanence, to love and to cherish, in sickness and in health, and thought about what those words become when they are a transaction. If anyone here knows of any reason why these two should not be joined in marriage, speak now or forever hold your peace. I stood. 200 people turned to look at me. The orchard was very quiet except for the wind through the apple trees. "Stop the ceremony," I said, "please." Evan's expression didn't break immediately. He had trained himself for uncertainty. He turned toward me with concern carefully arranged on his face. "Dorothy." "His name is not Evan Marsh," I said. I turned to face the guests. "His legal birth name is Tyler Ryan Rourke. He has an outstanding arrest warrant in Ontario for fraud and breach of trust. He has done this before, twice, in Calgary and in Quebec, and the families of both women have agreed to come forward today." The murmur that moved through the orchard was like wind changing direction. "He is not a wealth manager," I continued. He approached my physician to research the legal process for having me declared mentally incapacitated under BC's Patients' Property Act. He researched which medications would impair my cognition, and 11 days ago he put 4 milligrams of lorazepam into a glass of water, carried it to me personally, and encouraged me to drink it. Kathleen stood from her chair near the aisle. "I'm a solicitor with offices in Kelowna," she said, addressing the guests directly. "In this folder I have video footage of the incident Dorothy just described, laboratory results confirming the presence of lorazepam in the recovered sample, a full background investigation into Tyler Rourke's identity, documentation of the outstanding Ontario warrant, and written statements from both previous family." She held the folder up clearly. "Everything has been reviewed by the RCMP." "This is completely," Evan started. Meredith stood without being asked. "I'm Dorothy's family physician. Tyler Rourke came to my clinic and asked specific questions about how to initiate proceedings under the Patients' Property Act and about the sedative effects of lorazepam in older women. I have provided my full statement to the RCMP. Her voice was steady and final. Sophie stepped away from him. She didn't look at him when she did it. She looked at me. Corporal Baxter rose from his chair and moved through the row of stunned guests with the unhurried calm of someone who has done this before. His warrant card was already in his hand. Tyler Ryan Rourke, you're under arrest for fraud, identity misrepresentation, and administering a noxious substance. You have the right to retain and instruct counsel without delay. Do you understand? The brother made for the garden gate. He got perhaps 20 feet before Bruce stepped out from the equipment shed and a second officer came around from the Orchard Road. They were both in the RCMP vehicle before the apple trees stopped swaying. We sat on the porch steps for a long time after. Sophie had taken off her shoes. I'd loosened the collar of my jacket. The guests closest to Sophie had stayed and made tea and found a way to be useful, which is its own kind of love. I'm sorry, she said. For what? For not seeing it sooner. I almost didn't see it either, I said, and I spent 31 years watching people lie in court. The valley went gold in the late afternoon. Edmund had loved this hour, the light on the ridge, the way it turned the whole orchard amber. He used to stand right here and say that nothing this beautiful could truly be owned. You were just its steward for a while. Tyler Rourke was convicted 8 months later. The Ontario warrant had the longest reach. The Hamilton fraud charges added 3 years on top of what the BC proceedings brought. His brother received 18 months. The families in Calgary and Quebec settled their civil claims quietly, the way they had wanted to do years earlier, except this time they got to do it without paying him a cent. Sophie moved back to the orchard for a while. She planted garlic in November, which she said was therapeutic, and I didn't argue. She started seeing a counselor in Kelowna, went back to Vancouver in the spring, called me every Sunday, and sometimes on Tuesdays just to talk. Last month, she told me she'd agreed to have coffee with a landscape architect she'd met at a client presentation. She said he talked about trees the way her father had. I'm careful what I make of that. Hope is a thing that deserves time. I walk the orchard most mornings now, the same path Edmund used to take before breakfast, checking on the trees, 180 acres. The ridge to the east, the creek bed to the south, the water license that makes it all possible, the cider house where Edmund spent most of his happiest hours. He built this place for reasons that had nothing to do with its assessed value. He built it because he loved making something that would last longer than he did. I walk his path in the mornings, and I keep it safe. That's enough. That has always been enough.